These motherfuckers are making a lot of money.
Yeah, I see them.
Myers is making a lot of fucking money. How the hell is he doing it? We need to find out now.
March 1983, Mount Vernon, New York. Federal narcotics agents entered the home of Freddie Myers, a man known on the streets as New York Freddy. They weren't walking into the apartment of an ordinary Harlem dealer. Inside, investigators discovered $1.3 million in cash, another $1.3 million in diamond jewelry, 29 fur coats, and 3 Mercedes-Benz automobiles. But that was only the beginning. For years, Myers had allegedly controlled a heroin operation stretching through West Harlem, turning blocks around 114th to 120th Streets into open-air drug markets. Now the federal government was about to expose exactly how his empire worked, and how a Harlem street dealer had accumulated a fortune that authorities could barely believe. For the federal agents standing inside that house, the cash was only part of the story. They were looking at the accumulated wealth of a man prosecutors said had built a large-scale heroin distribution organization, operating primarily in Harlem. The government alleged that Myers controlled heroin sales between 114th and 120th Streets on Harlem's west side, an area authorities described as having become a series of open-air heroin markets. But the raid had not happened overnight.
These motherfuckers are making a lot of money. I see them. Unit 2, we got eyes.
For approximately 10 months, the Drug Enforcement Administration had been quietly building a case against Myers. Investigators had begun with information from confidential sources, records recovered from another arrested heroin dealer, and telephone company records. They placed Myers under surveillance at his home on Bradley Avenue in Mount Vernon and at his Manhattan office. Over time, the investigation expanded, bringing several other people into the government's sights. And now, on that March morning, the investigation had reached its climax. Agents searched 7 locations connected to the suspected organization. Myers was arrested at his home. His common-law wife, Aliebi Affleck, was also arrested. Other alleged members of the organization were taken into custody as investigators moved through the network they had spent months documenting.
Jesus Christ, how much is this?
Inside Myers' house, the scale of the wealth was extraordinary. Agents found $757,940 stuffed inside a large black suitcase in the attic crawl space. Another $580,100 was hidden inside a safe in a master bedroom closet. Another $40,000 was found inside a woman's handbag, with another $1,200 sitting on top of a dresser. When the agents finished counting, the total came to $1,379,240. Then came the jewelry.
Jesus, that's a lot of jewelry for one person.
Tell me about it.
The government valued it at $1,371,105. There were also the Mercedes-Benz cars and the 29 fur coats. To investigators, the contents of that house were evidence of something far bigger than a man who happened to have money. They were looking at what prosecutors would describe as the financial rewards of a heroin organization operating at a substantial scale. But there was another clue inside the house. Documents and photographs connected Myers to several of the other people investigators had been following. The government would eventually present Myers as the head of the organization, with Lloyd Ward described as his principal business partner and Charles Cavaness and Stephen Young portrayed as lieutenants responsible for parts of the operation. Another man, Keith Anderson, was alleged to operate what investigators called a heroin mill, where relatively pure heroin was processed and diluted before distribution. Aliebi Affleck and members of her family were accused of acting as couriers, while other individuals allegedly handled street-level sales. The organization, prosecutors argued, had layers. At the top was Myers. Below him were trusted associates. Below them were people handling processing and transportation. And beneath them were the people who actually put the heroin onto Harlem streets. That structure was critical because Myers wasn't being prosecuted simply as someone who possessed drugs. The government was attempting to prove that he operated a continuing criminal enterprise, the federal statute designed to target major drug organizations. But before the government could convince a jury, investigators had to show how Myers' organization actually operated. And that investigation had already produced something else: surveillance footage. One location became particularly important. It was a building with a red door on 5th Avenue, between 118th and 119th Streets. Investigators observed groups of people gathering around it. One man, William Bivens, appeared to control access to the location. On another occasion, investigators observed Bivens on West 120th Street, handing a woman approximately a dozen small packages, which he appeared to exchange for money. A government narcotics expert later told the jury that he believed the location was being used for heroin distribution. But Myers' defense would challenge that interpretation. His lawyers argued that the red door location was associated with a numbers operation rather than a heroin operation. They were essentially telling the jury that investigators were looking at suspicious behavior and interpreting it through the lens of the drug investigation. That distinction would become important because the government's case against Myers was overwhelmingly circumstantial. The Second Circuit later noted that the prosecution's evidence was circumstantial and reviewed the evidence in considerable detail when Myers and the other defendants appealed their convictions. But investigators had more than surveillance. They had wiretaps. In January 1983, after months of surveillance and information from confidential sources, the government obtained authorization to intercept calls to and from 2 telephone numbers at Myers' Mount Vernon home. The order was later extended and expanded to include telephones at his Manhattan office. The conversations helped investigators connect Myers to the people around him. And one particular incident would become significant at trial. It happened at a place called the Flash Inn. Investigators observed Myers sitting inside his Mercedes with another person. The car remained there with its engine running and lights on for roughly 25 minutes. Then a white Lincoln with Pennsylvania plates pulled up. 2 unidentified men were inside. One of the men approached Myers' Mercedes and spoke with Myers and his passenger before returning to the Lincoln.
The money's ready. Good. The heroin? It's in the trunk. Count it, we deal. Done.
The men then went inside the Flash Inn. The passenger from Myers' vehicle eventually emerged carrying a different handbag.
Suspect's moving. Corner ahead.
I see him. He's alone.
Roger, maintaining visual.
He placed that bag in the trunk of the Lincoln before returning inside. 2 minutes later, Myers walked out, returned to his Mercedes, and drove away. No one was arrested during the incident. No heroin was recovered. No one actually opened the handbag in front of the investigators. But prosecutors argued that the entire sequence was consistent with a narcotics transaction. A government detective testified that based on his experience, he believed a drug transaction had taken place. The defense disagreed. That would become one of the issues Myers challenged on appeal. But by then, prosecutors had assembled something they believed was much bigger than one suspicious meeting. They had the cash, they had the surveillance, they had the intercepted conversations, they had alleged heroin processing equipment. They had evidence connecting Myers to the people investigators believed were running the street operation. And they had the extraordinary wealth.
Myers is making a lot of fucking money. How the hell is he doing it? We need to find out now.
The question was where that wealth had come from. Because Freddie Myers wasn't simply living comfortably, he was living extravagantly. The federal government's case portrayed a man who had managed to accumulate enormous wealth despite having a history of narcotics convictions. A later Reagan administration Justice Department document summarized Myers' background by noting that he had previously been convicted of a federal narcotics offense around 1973, for which he received a 3-year sentence and served approximately 20 months. The document also said he had previously served time on 2 state assault robbery cases. So Myers wasn't new to the criminal justice system. He had already experienced prison. He had already experienced a federal narcotics conviction. And yet, according to the government, he returned to the drug trade and eventually built something substantially larger. That history makes the 1983 raid even more significant. The federal government wasn't dealing with a first-time offender. It believed it was dealing with a repeat offender who had progressed into something much bigger. And that is where the story of New York Freddy becomes a story about Harlem itself. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, New York's drug economy was undergoing a transformation. Heroin remained deeply entrenched in parts of the city, while cocaine was becoming increasingly important. But before crack would dominate the popular memory of New York's 1980s drug era, heroin organizations had already created sophisticated distribution systems. Freddie Myers was operating inside that earlier world. His organization was allegedly built around retail heroin distribution, rather than the enormous crack empires that would later become synonymous with the decade. That distinction matters. When people hear 1980s New York drug kingpin, they often immediately think about crack. But Myers' story takes us into the heroin economy immediately before crack became the defining drug of the era. And his operation allegedly had a structure that looked remarkably like a business. The Second Circuit's account of the government's case described Lloyd Ward as Myers' principal business partner. Charles Cavanass and Stephen Young were portrayed as lieutenants. Keith Anderson was alleged to run the heroin mill. Couriers moved packages. Street-level sellers distributed the product. That hierarchy was important. A kingpin could not personally stand on every street corner. He needed trusted people. He needed transportation. He needed places where drugs could be processed. He needed people who could deliver packages. And most importantly, he needed people who could sell without exposing the person at the top. The investigation attempted to demonstrate precisely that structure. Surveillance officers watched Young and Cavanass around Myers. Young was seen entering Myers' garage when Myers wasn't home. Both men sometimes drove Myers' cars or chauffeured him between his home and Manhattan office. Investigators also watched Cavanass. He allegedly brought packages to Myers' house late at night. He drove Myers around, and investigators eventually connected him to the alleged heroin processing location. The evidence against Young included a search of his apartment where agents found a scale, lactose, a substance that can be used to dilute heroin, holsters and ammunition. Then there was the alleged heroin mill. Investigators searched an apartment associated with Anderson and found materials they said were consistent with heroin processing. A government expert later explained to the jury how heroin mills operated and why certain materials could be associated with the process. The defense offered its own expert, who suggested that the apartment could have been a place where diluents were sold rather than a heroin processing operation. Again, the jury had competing interpretations, but prosecutors were building a cumulative case. No single piece of evidence necessarily proved everything. Instead, they argued that the pieces fit together. The money, the surveillance, the phones, the relationships, the alleged heroin mill, the street activity, the unexplained wealth. and the alleged narcotics transactions. Then there was the flash-in incident. The government argued that Myers himself had helped arrange the meeting. A call from his home was used to arrange the meeting, and investigators said Myers participated in selecting the location. The behavior was secretive. The handbags changed hands. People arrived separately, and Myers left immediately afterward. The Second Circuit later concluded that, when considered alongside the rest of the evidence, the jury could reasonably infer that the flash-in meeting involved narcotics. But the case was not without complications. One of the most revealing details is that investigators did not find heroin during every search they conducted. For example, a search of an apartment belonging to Tangi Affleck did not uncover narcotics. Agents had relied partly on a police dog's indication that heroin was present, but the indication proved wrong. Instead, investigators found an automatic rifle and ammunition. The defense used such evidence to challenge the government's interpretation of the investigation. But the prosecution continued. 5 weeks of trial testimony followed. By the end, the jury had heard the government's version of how the organization allegedly operated. Myers and the other defendants had the opportunity to present their own evidence and explanations. Then came the verdict.
Your Honor, I am not guilty. Objection, Your Honor. Badgering the witness. I demand to be heard. Counsel, control your client.
The jury convicted Freddie Myers of conspiring to distribute heroin and possess heroin with intent to distribute it. It also convicted him of conducting a continuing criminal enterprise. The Second Circuit later affirmed Myers' convictions, although it did overturn the forfeiture of his home, because the government had not sufficiently established the required connection between that particular property and the criminal activity proven at trial. The sentence was severe: 40 years in federal prison. He was also fined $100,000, and the government was permitted to confiscate enormous portions of the wealth found during the raid. The $1.3 million in cash, the $1.3 million in jewelry, the fur coats and automobiles. For the government, the case represented the dismantling of a major Harlem heroin operation. For Myers, it represented the collapse of a world he had spent years building. But the consequences didn't stop with him. His family was left behind. His daughter, Freddie Myers, later spoke publicly about growing up with both parents incarcerated and the experience of traveling to prisons to visit her father. The federal case records show us the organization. The newspaper reports show us the raid. The courtroom record shows us what prosecutors proved and what Myers challenged. But his daughter's account shows what happened after the headlines disappeared. The money was seized. The cars were gone. The jewelry was gone. The fur coats were gone. And Freddie Myers was behind bars. The empire that had allegedly turned sections of West Harlem into open-air heroin markets was no longer operating under his control. And yet, when looking back at the case, decades later, one detail remains almost impossible to ignore: the amount of money found in that Mount Vernon house. $1,379,240 in cash. Not a bank balance, not an investment portfolio. Cash. Hundreds of thousands hidden inside an attic crawl space. More hidden inside a bedroom safe. More inside a handbag. And alongside it, more than $1.3 million in jewelry. It was the physical evidence of a particular era of American organized drug trafficking, a time when enormous amounts of cash could be generated on city streets and then converted into jewelry, automobiles, property, and luxury goods. But the same wealth that represented success also created the trail that brought investigators to the door. Myers had become visible. His lifestyle had become difficult to hide. His associates had become visible. His phones had become targets. His movements were being followed. And eventually, the government had enough evidence to obtain search warrants and bring the organization into federal court.
Yeah, I see them.
The story of New York Freddy, therefore, isn't simply a story about a man who became rich selling heroin.
These heroin deals.
It's a story about how a street-level drug economy became organized into something resembling a corporation, with a leader, partners, lieutenants, couriers, processors, and sellers. And it's also a story about how law enforcement learned to dismantle those organizations by following something that drug dealers could never completely hide: the money. Because drugs disappear, cash changes hands, people lie. But a fortune of more than $1 million in physical currency is difficult to explain. And when investigators find that fortune, alongside surveillance, intercepted calls, associates, suspected processing equipment, and evidence of street-level distribution, the pieces begin to form a picture. For Freddie Myers, that picture ended in a federal courtroom. The man who prosecutors portrayed as the head of a Harlem heroin empire was convicted. The fortune was seized, the organization was dismantled, and Myers was sent away for 4 decades. But the name New York Freddy survived. It survived in court records, it survived in newspaper archives, it survived in the memories of Harlem. And eventually it became the subject of a documentary and a daughter's attempt to tell the story from the perspective of the family left behind. There is a temptation when telling stories about old drug kingpins to focus entirely on the money, the cars, the jewelry, the fur coats, the expensive homes. But the records tell us something darker. Behind that wealth was a heroin market that investigators said had transformed parts of West Harlem into open-air drug markets. Behind the luxury was an organization that prosecutors said relied on numerous people to process, transport, and sell heroin. And behind the kingpin was a family that eventually had to live with the consequences of his imprisonment. That is the part of the story that the cash cannot tell you. Freddie Myers could accumulate millions. He could drive Mercedes-Benz automobiles. He could surround himself with jewelry and fur coats. He could build an organization powerful enough to attract a 10-month federal investigation. But eventually, all of it came down to one morning in March 1983. Agents entered his Mount Vernon home. They found the money. They found the jewelry. They found the evidence prosecutors would later use against him. And they arrested New York Freddy. The man who had allegedly controlled a significant slice of Harlem's heroin trade was no longer controlling anything. His fortune belonged to the government. His organization was collapsing, and his next destination was federal prison. For the next 40 years, the streets that had once made Freddie Myers wealthy would continue changing without him. Heroin would eventually share the spotlight with cocaine. Crack would transform New York's drug markets. New generations of dealers would become famous. Names that are far more recognizable today would emerge from Harlem, Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. But before those stories became part of popular culture, there was another generation of drug traffickers. And one of the most fascinating was the man the streets called New York Freddy. A Harlem heroin kingpin who lived in suburban luxury. A man whose home contained more than $2.7 million in cash and jewelry when federal agents searched it. A convicted drug trafficker who received 40 years in federal prison. And a figure whose story offers a rare glimpse into the machinery of New York's heroin economy, just before the crack era changed the city forever. This was the rise, the empire, and the fall of New York Freddie Myers.